I'm not sure. I definitely would not call myself a leader in the space, but and when I saw the program that said I was going to give opening remarks, I was like, ah. But let me say some things that I think are hopefully going to help set the stage a bit. So I think Andrew really gave much of the introduction, as we know that, in general, modern populism is seen as an agenda of the economic elites, who take on people in this room, the political and intellectual elites, ostensibly on the behalf of the poor. But I think a lot of what we'll talk about and what I want to talk about is that this is arguably in their own economic interest, that what's driving this populism is not great concern for the poor, but a very cynical realization that you can actually do this and sustain your own economic agenda. A lot of the literature on environmental populism, and I think this will be probably reflected to some extent in discussions here, have really focused on rich countries. So we hear a lot about climate denialism in places like the US, we hear a lot about alliances forming in Europe, but a lot less about economic populism in lower income countries or in the global south more generally. And what I really want to spend my time doing today is arguing that actually we are seeing global populism take off a lot in the global south, especially in those countries which I think have pushed very strongly to argue the case for economic growth. And so by claiming that, as a lower income country, we can only focus on economic growth, it often is giving cover to the economic elite, especially in an era where economic growth is raising inequality a lot. So what do we know? We know the problem. So I'm just going to spend one slide on it. We've had over 4 decades of, I think, both international and domestic political meets on this. 1979 was the first climate conference. But there's just been an inexorable rise in carbon in the atmosphere. So what do we think about the politics problem in rich countries? Well, the conundrum is that even in a rich country, you are appealing to across the spectrum. And so in the same voice, Boris Johnson would vow to a 78% emissions cut by 2035 and also say that boosting economic growth is a priority. And to some extent, it's led to a little bit of an unclear conversation about how do you take on this agenda, or where do you go in creating a case for decarbonization? Should it be saying that you have green growth? Should it be degrowth? And a lot of the discussions, I think, get bogged around that. But when we think about the global south, there's still a broad sense that, well, what the global south wants is growth. So Indira Gandhi was, in 1972, she was the only prime minister of a country who was there in the Conference on Human Environment. And I think to a large extent, what she said then is still seen as defining the global south agenda. Right? On the one hand, the rich look askance at their continuing poverty. We do not wish to impoverish the environment, and yet we cannot for a moment forget the grim poverty of large numbers of people. I think this is very much seen as the global south's problem. They need growth. And so you see, carbon-intensive growth is often framed in terms of the development agenda. So these are just, 2 quotes, but I think it's very common to hear this claim that India needs coal, India needs cheap power in order to continue its sustainable development goals. But, as in countries like India get richer, they also are seen increasingly as important for mitigation. But the claims they make are not very different from, I'd say, the contrary claims made by Boris Johnson. So this was at, COP25, where Modi said from now till 2030, India will reduce 1 billion tons of the projected carbon emissions. You go to a couple other COPs ahead, and he talks about how a proud moment for India was crossing the monumental milestone of 1 billion tons of coal production. So what I want to talk about is how in lower income countries in the global south, in countries like India, but possibly also Nigeria, Indonesia, fast-growing countries, you're seeing economic growth. You're seeing a lot of rise in inequality. And there is this narrative around continuing growth which is largely serving the same purpose that populism in rich countries serves of helping the economic elite continue with what they want. So environmental populism, I think, has always been seen correctly is that it's a domestic politics issue, and it's largely seen as a domestic politics issue in kind of richer global North countries. But I think what I want to argue is that we're now beginning to see this also emerge in global South countries. It's not going to take the form of climate denialism. I think the effects of increasingly hot summers is way too obvious in low-income countries for there to be climate denialism. But I think it's around forming political coalitions. And one of the most important ways this happens, it's around the convenience of fossil fuel consumption. And that's probably not the only one, but that's the example I'm going to focus on for it. So, Leo Chancel has done some very nice work thinking about the links between economic inequality and climate inequality. This is from a paper he has in Nature Sustainability, pointing out that in 1990, 62% of the global inequality was due to between country inequality. And that was, I think, very much the traditional politics we would think of between global South and global North. But by 2019, he says 64% of the carbon inequality is due to within country inequality. And I think this graph sort of exemplifies this, which is what he calls the kind of triple climate inequality crisis, where if you see the relative losses, they're the highest in the bottom 50%, irrespective of which country you're in. Emissions increase with income, but what really increases with income is the capacity to finance emission reductions. And if you, as a rich person's country, don't want to finance these cuts in emissions, then you want to create a political narrative which argues that this is not what the country should be doing. And one way of doing it is by creating common cause about how, for instance, fossil fuel subsidies would benefit the poor as well as help keep the rich rich. So this is Adani, India's richest person. And I think, again, it exemplifies a lot of the Adani wealth in India is of energy, it's of airports. And a lot of what gets pushed is, again, the pictures of airports of increasing pool use is pushed as a way of making India and the poor richer. And things like reductions of fossil fuel subsidies in this narrative are also being seen as that these are the groups who are getting harmed by environmental damages are going to also be harmed by the remedies. And I think that's exactly what Andrew was talking about when he was talking about the coal mine closures, that we forget the fact that in the very short run, the poor are going to feel, for instance, the loss of employment. So today we have around more than $500 billion being spent on fossil fuel subsidies. And redistribution that makes this exploitation cheaper right now across countries is favored both by the very rich and by the poor. For natural resource extraction, for instance, like quarrying in mines, historically the way the rich protected themselves was by distance. They didn't live where the mines were, so they didn't see the water pollution, not the extreme local pollution. But I think increasingly now with climate change, they are going to pull by adaptation. And again, that may be a reason why the rich can insulate themselves to a large extent. And so you want to see increasingly, you're going to see these coalitions of the rich and poor come together to form taxes, to reject the removal of subsidies. And this really is the kind of fertile ground that I think is giving rise to populism in the global South as well. And so in fact, Andrew again had talked about the Gilets Jaunes protests in France, but it's also good to remember very similar protests were happening in Kenya in 2023 around fuel taxes. Another example is General Robin and others have worked on is thinking about cheap energy in low-income countries. That's again another example where if you try to remove energy subsidies, it will be the farmers who will be one of the first groups to protest against that. So why do we need to move on something like fossil fuel subsidies? As I said, and I think this is from a paper of Alan's, there is a lot of support in theory for protection and even protection at the cost of development. as I said, I think if you go to many low-income countries, there's now significant recognition of climate change and a recognition that something needs to be done about it. But in the same paper, I think Alan and his co-authors show that there's very little action that takes place by politicians on it. And this is also exemplified is that if you then ask about, is there support for removing fossil fuel subsidies, it's low. It's not at the levels you'd expect to see it. And so you see across countries, you're going to see often small-term measures like, especially on carbon pricing, they will come with what is seen as the left-wing elite government, and then they will move off. In lower income countries, you don't actually see so much distinction between left and right, and say on something like carbon pricing. No one wants carbon pricing because it's seen as something that's against the poor. And as I said, fossil fuel subsidies remain strong. So let me end and then open up for questions with just a couple of thoughts. I'm going to start with maybe something a little more negative, but then hopefully end by talking about what I think might be some way forward. So I think what I've been arguing here is the nature of modern economic growth in low-income countries is a very disequalizing growth. And there is a concern that economic inequality combined with sort of modern populism, which takes the form of the extreme rich and poor coming together very often on, say, natural resource extraction and fossil fuels, can continue to create a vicious spiral between economic and climate inequality. And so I think the open question, which I hope we will get to discuss quite a lot in the next day and a half, is really how do we prevent this? And let me start by just throwing out one idea that Robin and I and some others, and Lucy and others have been developing, which is really to start thinking a lot more about markets rather than taxes. I think we've seen across a number of countries that carbon taxes are something that politically are immediately seen as toxic. In contrast, I think markets are often seen as a way of having more flexibility of choice of what you can do. Right now, the main way in which we see potentially resources going from the global north to the global south for adaptation, but potentially also for helping support reductions in, say, fossil fuel subsidies, is voluntary carbon markets, which are tending to fail. And they're tending to fail because they, for two reasons. First, the quality of the carbon offsets is poor. But second, importantly, there is no centralized price setting mechanism that says that the price should be set high enough to recognize both the social cost of carbon, but importantly also, what is the cost the development requires? That what is if a Zimbabwean farmer is going to say that I will not cut trees on my land and undertake agriculture, what is the price that that person should be paid in order to move to a sustainable alternative form of development? And the same thing would be true, and Robin's thought about this in the context of Zambia, where they're thinking about mines that they're not able to develop if they don't cut forests. Markets, well done, which have actually functioned like a compliance market, so they have a cap that accounts for the emission scarcity, can start providing us prices that are informative and are informative of the choices that need to be made for us to be sustainable. And perhaps that's, it's a long shot, but it's one way of trying to think of tax-laying populism is through markets, which I think are less emotive than taxes, but also you can be much more transparent about how you set caps, who you give the initial set of permits to. So let me stop there, and I hope we hear many ideas in the conference. Thank you.
Comments, questions?
Is it reasonable for the Zimbabwean farmer to trust that the system is going to work out in his favors? I mean, it's kind of coming on the heels. The groundswell of populism has to do with the fact that globalization never really delivered from the middle class. And that was also a set of arguments about transfers that would eventually work out favorably for the middle class and the poor, and that were perceived not to have the reason to be distrustful.
No, I agree. And I think that's why you need work. But it's not as if it's not happening. Land grab has been going on for centuries. Right now, what's happening is, the Zimbabwean farmers getting approached by a private sector company paying you a very low price, but agriculture is no longer very profitable, and so you're willing to sell. Hope is that a regulated mechanism means that you get a price that's going to be higher than what you're willing to sell for. So I guess the difference is it's not as if the economic activities that are being undertaken instead of entering a market are offering you a much better deal. In fact, they're probably offering you a worse deal.
Because one of the things that really strikes me about this issue is that it compounds with polarization of information and the way people are searching for news or believing anything that some actor or other might say, right? And so it almost doesn't matter if what you're saying is true or not. There's a perception argument that plays around with, does the farmer even buy that this is the solution? How much are we even researching this? Because it strikes me that there's a gap of sorts.
So I think, again, I think we're not researching it enough, and we hope people in this room would do, but I can give you one example from my work where we looked at paying farmers in Punjab to prevent crop burning. And there was exactly the same issue of a lot of lack of trust in the government about the fact that every year someone comes and tells us, do X instead, we lose a bunch of money. And a lot of the question we asked was, how can you design contracts to address this? And so from an economist's perspective, there is a trade-off. If you have any kind of conditional contract, if you pay some amount of that money upfront, so unconditionally on compliance, you reduce the incentives of the farmer to undertake that activity. But on the other hand, you can help build trust. And so I think one way to respond to your question is that I think we need to start thinking about how do we do things like design contracts, how do we design features of markets that account for the fact that people are possibly starting from a level of distrust. And often that may require giving resources upfront, even though as economists, that's not something we would be comfortable with.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting what you say about the market, and I guess we tried the government for a long time, but in the form of Begovian taxes and hasn't worked so far. You know this new paper by Patrick Bolt on and others, which is forthcoming in the QJ, which is a very different take on it. Let's do coals instead of people. Let's pay whoever has carbon in the ground to keep it in the ground rather than sell it. And surprisingly, once they look at very wide confidence intervals for the central parameters, it almost always pays for the one to do this, and very clearly so.
I think I talked about it. I haven't read the paper, which I should. But I think in some ways it's a very similar idea, right? What you're keeping in the ground might be coal. It might be actually a carbon sink by keeping forests in the same place. It could be like preventing mining of coal. And I think the question really is how do you write those contracts, and what do things like permanence in the setting mean? How long do you write these contracts for? Do you think of them as these are all features that should be worked on? One of the things that's striking to me is you think that whenever there's discussion of markets, economists should be in that discussion. But if you think about a lot of discussions that go on in COP around, say, Article 6.4, which is supposed to be a centralized carbon mechanism, there are no economists in that conversation. And so I think it's probably one of the things that we should be doing is trying to enter a lot more the space of climate negotiations that right now has a lot of lawyers and a lot of politicians, but very few economists. Because precisely because you said economists are thinking about people paying taxes which are not politically very favorable. Someone behind you.
Talk about the inequality and think about global global south. One of the things very important is because of capital is very cheap, and the global north is not always the global south. So in the COP, we have now loss in reparation, which is a big thing. We used to have the green growth fund, for example, stuff like that makes capital cheaper and for project. I wonder if that's an avenue to help with Essentially financing these renewable energy projects require substantial amount of capital. So if your capital is pricey because there's risk premium and the grid is not stable enough, I think there's like things that hinder them from actually benefiting from the transition itself. And one of these things is capital, which we do have.
So the capital who has, the south or the north?
The North has capital.
The north has, so I guess it's the type of capital, so yes, and the north has, I guess, maybe has cash, but also reducing kind of carbon emissions is much more expensive in the north than the south. So the idea of these kind of markets would exactly be to, in the very short run, what you want to do if you have limited climate financing is you want to save, say, the forests, where is the cheapest to do so, which is often in the global south. But I think the question, and that comes back to I think what Mike was saying, is how do you do it in a way that is going to be fair? So you also have to think about, I think, issues of climate justice and thinking about how to set those level of transfers.
Okay, we probably need to move on. Just one question for me. Without wanting to oversimplify, if you look at the environmental movement in the West, it has grown up in a kind of elitist and has not paid anywhere near enough attention to people. It's now looking at itself in the mirror, and it's actually much too late, is really scurrying to take people, especially the poor and those affected, into account. In developing countries, environmental organizations have always been much closer to the people. And I wonder if that provides at least some comfort that we won't get into the same set of problems. But on the other hand, of course, in the North and rich countries, doing transfers and compensation is easier at one level. The resources are not available. So how do you, as you sort of look at the developing countries, is this problem going to grow and grow and grow?
It's going to grow unless we empower, as you said, these bottom-up growth. You're absolutely right. So if you think about something like forest protection movements across South Asia and India and Nepal and all of these are very much bottom-up,
Yes.
Chipko movement, all of these. But it's always seen as a case where it's us against the state. And it's something where I think you have to think about, how do you actually first build them property rights, which in a lot of these countries, they don't have property rights over land, over their forests. So, and then actually, figure out how market mechanisms would reach them.
Yeah. Good.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Rohini.